You teach people to live by a guiding question. You say it's just simple to ask, what does love require of me in this situation?
All right, so we're starting Galatians 2 today. So if you have a Bible, you want to go to Galatians 2. And we're going to jump from there and kind of move into all different parts of Scripture. But one of the things that is important is as we studied Galatians 2, we came to a place where something doesn't occur anymore. The early church had conflict. Now, we don't ever have that anymore in our lives. We don't have that anymore in churches. And so it's kind of a relevant topic to cover. But I decided, you know what, it's okay for us to be a little irrelevant on occasion and cover something that no one needs to hear about, which is how to manage and handle conflict. Got it? So again, I know this doesn't apply to you, but you probably have a neighbor this applies to. You might have a child, a grandchild, a brother, sister, maybe even a friend that you go, hey, they really should listen to this. And so after today, when you've heard it all, you can go refer your friend to our YouTube channel and say, you really need to hear what our pastor said, all right? And then don't say anything more. Just see how that goes, all right? And so here's why we're why we're covering a sermon on conflict, and we're going to talk about it. It's because a church that gives grace will have conflict. Did you know that? A church that gives grace will have conflict because when you give grace, what happens is people come in who are messy, don't have life figured out. And then we give what we call messy grace because it's like, well, I'm not always sure which, like, is there more truth? Is there more grace? Do I need more discipline? Do I need to be more just kind and caring? And sometimes we mess it up because none of us are Jesus, right? And so a church that gives grace is going to get messy. And here's how this happens, okay? And I love this. We really are kind of new into this room, but I don't know if you know this or not, but most of you already have assigned seats. Yeah, you come in and you're kind of like, this is where I sit on Sunday. And there's nothing wrong with that, but let me give you an example how this works out in churches. Somebody new walks in and they sit in your seat, and it's like no big deal, right? But somebody from the existing congregation sits in your seat, and you look at him, and you're like, dude, that's my seat. You should know that. You sit over there. Now, the reason I say that is because we're actually often pretty good at giving grace to those outside the church. We're really not good at giving grace to those inside the church. Now, this isn't new. We're actually all pretty good at giving grace to people at work, but not to our spouse or to our family members or to those who we live with, right? I'm really good at giving all my patience and all my measure of before it starts to irritate me away at work, but by the time I get home, there's none left for Sarah, right? And so we all do this. We're really good at giving grace to those who we may never see again, but to those who are right here in inner circle, we're not very good at. And this is why this is important, because a church that gives grace is going to have conflict, and we need to learn how to manage our conflict. The second thing is a church or individual that stands for truth will have conflict. Did you know that? I hope that doesn't surprise you, right? When we got ready to do our sermon on abortion, my wife was having a heart attack the entire week beforehand. In fact, I had to preview it through her to make sure it's filled with enough grace. And I appreciate that because I really don't ever care what people think, right? If it's truth, we're good to go. My wife balances me out because she's like, well, she always reminds, if no one's following you, you're not really leading, right? And so when we got ready to do that sermon, she's saying, there was going to be conflict. And when you stand for truth, there'll be conflict. When you say, hey, here's just how it is, right? There's going to be conflict. And so how do you have both the tension of truth and grace and make sure you're giving those, right? The third thing is when you are a church or individual that thinks critically about important things. So one of the issues that we're seeing more and more right now with our youth is sexual identity. All over. Am I trans? Am I homosexual? Am I lesbian? Am I this or am I that? Am I that? And the list goes on and on. And so what we've been kind of doing is your church leadership is saying, hey, in the fall, we're going to need to talk about this. Why? Because we're a church that wants to think critically about important things. And therefore, what happens is that if we don't cover this, we feel like we've left you unarmed and unequipped to have these conversations. And so when your child comes in and says, Mom, I'm wrestling with this, or Dad, I'm wrestling with this, or your grandkids, I'm wrestling with this, we don't want to leave you going, I've never thought about it, oh my gosh. We want you to be like, hey, I'm glad you brought this to my attention. Let's talk about it. Let's walk into this. We don't need to be afraid of this conversation. Again, we think critically about important things. That's one of the hallmarks about what it means to be part of Faith Ignited. We're not afraid of the tough subjects, and we think God has an opinion and that God loves everybody. And so how do we put all that together in our conversations? One more. All right, we're not afraid, and we think that a church that thinks critically, or excuse me, a church or individual that thinks critically, all right, is going to move people closer to Jesus. And when you're moving people closer to Jesus, there's an enemy who doesn't want that to happen. And so he's going to stand against you, which is going to cause conflict. Last one. A church or individual that asks the question, what does love require of me in this situation, may actually intentionally cause conflict. Because love has boundaries. And therefore, in order for a relationship to grow, there'll be moments where we're like, yeah, I'm intentionally causing conflict. I'm intentionally causing conflict. And usually our conflict is around this idea. Our conflict is around expectations. I don't know if any of you have thought about this, but most of your conflict is around this idea of this is what I expected to happen, this is what I wanted to happen, or this is what I expected to happen, and I never told you, and therefore now we have conflict. Right? So what I want to do is I want to give you a couple of quick examples. By the way, this is my mother and father right here on the front row. Hi, Mom. Hi, Dad. It's pretty cool to have them join us today. And I'm going to actually, I've taken two of your stories because you've shared them enough that I stole them and I use them now. So thank you for sharing. All right? And so here's one of my father's stories about expectations. He talks about when he got sick as a child, Grandma would come in. Of course, she wasn't Grandma. She was Mom to him. And she would make chicken noodle soup and take care of him. He would be on the couch, and and by the way, if we had only known chicken noodle soup and kisses from Mom, we could have solved COVID, right? But there it is, right? Chicken noodle soup, and Mom would stay home and kind of nurse and care for him. And he shares a story of the first time he really gets sick after he gets married, and he's talking to my mom, and he's like, I'm not feeling really good. And she's like, okay, thanks for letting me know. I'll see you after work. He talks about wrestling with the idea that my expectation was kind of that my wife would stay home and nurse and care for me. She would make chicken noodle soup and love me and get me back to health. And I was a little frustrated. Why? I never communicated that. That's what he expected to happen. On the other side of that, my mom would share the story that she, when they got married, would drive the car and drive the car and drive the car, because that's what you do with the car. You drive it and you drive it and you drive it and you drive it. And one day Dad gets in and he says to her, Roxy, your oil change is way overdue. What's going on? And she was kind of like, I just assumed that the man took care of that. Now, those are two funny ones that they've shared a lot. I was able to steal them and share them with you. And here's what I want you to know. Just there were two expectations there that were not spoken that didn't cause major conflict, right? But if you think back to your last time you really had a good fight with somebody, I bet you it was over expectations that either didn't get communicated or didn't get met. You thinking through that? This is what I wanted to happen. This is what did happen. This is what I wanted to happen. This is what did not happen, right? And so here we go. One of the biggest gauges or best gauges for spiritual and emotional maturity is how we handle conflict. In fact, my wife and I were privileged to hang out with a couple this past week, and the gentleman shared, he said, man, about a year ago, this is how I would have reacted to this situation, and then this year I did not. And I'm sitting there listening to the story, and I'm celebrating because I'm like, you're moving closer to Jesus. You're handling conflict better. You're in charge of your emotions and surrendering some of your life to God, and you're no longer living in your broken past, because that's why we react the way we do. We go, this is my past, it defines me, and therefore I'm going to react this way. And I thought, this is awesome. You're maturing in Jesus. How do you handle conflict? Would people look at your life and go, there's a mature Christian who loves Jesus? Or would they look and go, there's someone broken and bleeding and wounded all over. I hope they get better, right? Now, this is a big deal because if we're going to be a hospital for sinners, when somebody walks in broken and bleeding and wounded, if we don't know how to handle conflict, we're eventually going to what them? We're going to wound them because we don't know how to handle conflict. Or we're going to love and care for them and help them move forward. So let's crawl into the scripture real quick. Galatians 2, all right, you want to join us? It says, when Cephas, now you may, who's Cephas? I don't know who Cephas is. I've never heard of Cephas before. It's okay. This is the guy named Peter, the main disciple, the guy who walked on the water, the guy who denied Jesus, the guy who takes a sword and hacks off the dude's ear in the garden. All right, this is Peter. All right, but remember when he's hanging out with Jesus, Jesus changes his name and says, from now on you'll be called Peter. Well, Paul, who is very much into the Hebrew tradition, still uses Peter's previous name. All right, and he says, when Cephas came from Antioch, I opposed him to his face because he stood condemned. For before certain men came from him, all right, James, he used to eat with us, the Gentiles. So let me break this down for you. Paul, who's writing the book of Galatians, is saying, look, we were hanging out, right? Many days. And then Peter showed up, right? And he was hanging out with us. And then James and some of the other Hebrews, all right, they came over, and then suddenly we had some conflict, right? Because when they arrived, we began to separate. Peter began to separate himself from the Gentiles because he was afraid of those who belonged to the circumcision group. And then other Jews, they joined him in the hypocrisy. Peter wouldn't eat with us because we weren't quite living into all the old Hebraic laws. And then even Barnabas joined him. We have a serious problem. A serious problem. Now, let me help point out a couple things. The first thing Paul does when he opposes him is he immediately goes on Facebook and starts blasting Peter, right? Do you see that? All right? Let me show you here. All right? When Cephas came to Antioch, I opposed him on Facebook, and I made a TikTok about it, right? And that's how I handled the situation. Because social media is where to handle conflict, right? It's understood, right? That's how we do it today, right? I put a video, I put a post, I put something out, and there it is. And then you know how I feel, and I'm justified. Because social media is where to handle conflict. That's how Paul did it. And the reason I stop here and pause is because some of you are going to say, I have a kid who needs to see this message. All right? And you're not going to tell them why. And we're not too far into it, and they're already going to hear the secret right now. And you're just going to say to your son or daughter, hey, I need you to go watch the sermon, and our pastor has a secret message about it. How to handle conflict. And so here it is. If you're watching right now, I just want you to get it. Social media is never the place to handle conflict. I'm going to say it one more time. Social media is never the place to handle conflict. All right? If you're watching and someone referred you to this video, that's the secret message right there. Social media is never the place to handle conflict. Instead, what did Paul do? He said, I went and I opposed him to his face, meaning one-on-one. Now, I don't think Paul got up in his face. Right? This isn't meant to be understood like gangster talk. Right? I think Paul was kind of, hey, Pete, come here. Let's talk for a moment. All right, look, I know we're kind of sensitive about the Jewish law stuff, but here's what I want you to know. We're saved by faith alone, not by the dietary rights. And then Jesus said it was okay to eat anything we want, so you can't do that one time and then not the next time, depending on who shows up. We got to be consistent with how we live, right? So I think that was kind of the conversation that was had. Next slide. All right, we see then, and he says, when I saw they were not acting in line, this is Paul, he's saying, when I saw that they were not acting in line with the truth of the gospel, I said to Cephas, in front of them all. Now again, what he doesn't say is, I went on social media. He doesn't say, I got an entire team of people in the parking lot after the service, or I went to all my other co-workers at work, and then we started discussing what a terrible person this was. He says, I went to him individually. and we began to reason and have conflict in healthy ways. Now, you might go, well, where did Paul get this? Well, part of it could be that it's common sense, right? Next slide, we go say, again, I went to Cephas in front of them all. We might go, well, that's common sense. We should all know that, right? But the reality of it is that Paul was just following what Jesus taught him. Now, before we get there, I need to remind you of this. This is good conflict. The early church had conflict, and sometimes conflict is good. Sometimes conflict is not only good, but it's necessary. In fact, we could say it this way: conflict is not evil. It can lead to relational and personal and professional growth when handled correctly and maturely. In fact, there's not a healthy relationship that doesn't have some form of conflict, and if it's handled well, that relationship grows, that relationship becomes better, that relationship matures. Now, on the other side of that, some of you are like, yeah, but I know this doesn't always work. That's true. Because of this, because hurting people hurt others. Just a simple rule of life: hurting people hurt others. Unaddressed anger turns into hate. It's a cancer that eats away at your soul and destroys all the relationships, because hurting people hurt others. And so you may go, Aaron, I know conflict can be good, but I have a friend, and every time I bring something up, we end up in a fight, and it's never good. Why? Well, because your friend is so wounded by their past, and that still defines everything about them, that every time you bring something up, it's like taking a cheese grater across an open wound in their arm. And they're like, I can't even deal with whatever you're bringing, because why? Because this is all the stuff from my past that I constantly deal with. I can't handle where God wants me to go because I'm unwilling to grow through the pain of my past. Hurting people hurt others. So what do we do with all this? Well, we, number one, identify the pain, or as we said in our sermon series on forgiveness, name the pain and claim the sin. Right? I got to stop and go, hey, this is why I'm hurting, and this is why I'm hurting. I'm hurting, and this is why, right here. And then begin to go, okay, how should I process this in healthy ways, in ways that are good, in ways that are going to be beneficial for the relationship? And so then we create appropriate, caring, biblical conversations. Appropriate, caring, biblical conversations. So let me show you an example of how this could work out. All right, I'm going to name the pain. Hey, it really bothers me that you came home and you didn't bring me any lunch. Really bothers me. Again, we could say, what's the pain? Pain is I'm hungry. What's the expectation? I thought you were going to bring me home lunch. And so it really bothers me. I'm identifying, I'm naming the pain, I'm claiming the sin, or at least what I thought was sin, but here I got to pause. Because remember, see that word, biblical conversation. It's not a biblical attack. Here I got to claim the biblical conversation, which says, I may not know all of this situation. So step number 3 looks like this. All right? Recognize and give value to both sides. There may be a reason you didn't bring me anything home. All right? It may be that you forgot. It may be that where you went, they didn't have anything. There's 1,000 reasons, right? It could be that you were like, hey, I could have got you something, but it would have been 2 hours ago. By the time I got it home, it was cold. Right? It could have been that I gave it away to a homeless man on the way home because he looked like he was starving. Here, we just got to pause, and this is what happens. Out of my past woundedness, I insert stories into the story to make up for the unknown. Why didn't you bring me food home? Because you don't really care. Because you're a jerk. Because you don't want to take care of me. Because I'm never a priority for you. Right? Those are all stories I inserted into a narrative that, quite honestly, I don't even know how it should go. Why? Because I haven't asked you yet. And so I need to come and confront it with biblical, caring, appropriate conversation. So, again, a way this could go is, hey, I noticed you didn't bring me any food home. Notice my tone of voice. I feel a little hurt by that. Can you tell me why that didn't happen? I've just opened the door for a conversation. I'm going to help you out here, Mike. Okay, you ready? This is how not to do it. It's the same conversation, how not to do it. Just watch my tone of voice. Hey, idiot, I noticed you didn't bring me any food home. I feel like you don't give bop, bop, about me. Is that really what's going on? Because I feel like you're a jerk and you hate me right now. Right? Same type of thing. One of them I've just introduced into conversation. The other one I went into attack mode. Right? So our tone of voice has a big deal about that. Number 4. All right? Be quick to apologize and listen. Slow to what? Slow to anger, right? Jesus and Scripture often say something about that. Finally, number 5, differentiate and make wise decisions upon the information that you collect. Again, I can't differentiate if I haven't valued your side and gotten all the information. Okay? All right, now, Aaron, you said that if we just handle conflict Jesus' way, things would be better. You said that Jesus had something to say about conflict. Yep. Well, you've only talked about Paul. Okay, well, let's go to Jesus. Matthew 18. All right? He says, if your brother or sister sins, get on social media immediately and point it out and condemn them. I'm just joking again. That's not what it says at all, right? Now, pause. We got to confront a lie that many church people have believed here. And I'm not sure why. It sounds nice to say, and it sounds caring, but it's the opposite of caring, and it's the opposite of what should be said. Notice Jesus says, if your brother sins or sister sins, go to them and point out their faults. What you have done, if you do that, is you have immediately judged someone. And I hear people all the time, Jesus said don't judge. And I said, well, what's the rest of it? Because if you don't get the rest of it, you haven't got it right. Jesus said don't judge until what? You've taken the plank out of your eye, then go and remove the speck of sawdust from your neighbor's eye. Jesus doesn't say don't judge. We could never hold each other accountable in love, could we? Jesus says, hey, when you go to judge, first look in the mirror and make sure you're not being a hypocrite when you judge. Then go to your brother or sister in an appropriate, loving way, right, and point out their fault. Get the log out of your eye, then go and point out, hey, there's a speck of sawdust in your eye. I don't know if you noticed that. And it's not a condemning way. I love you, and I just want you to see that, right? And by the way, if the church did this more often, and we judged and held each other accountable inside the church and condemned those outside less, people might want to run to the church. We spend most of our time condemning those outside and not caring about the behaviors and attitudes of those in. All right, but let's go on. Ready? Jesus said, if your brother or sister sins, If your brother or sister sins, go and point out their fault between the two of you. What's the rule? Between who? Just the two of you. If they listen to you, you've won them over. Good job. 2 points for you. But if they will not listen, take 1 or 2 along so that the testimony of the witnesses may be there, right? And he says, and if they still don't listen, tell the church. And if they refuse to listen to the church, basically he says you have to set up healthy boundaries. Treat them as you would a pagan or tax collector. Set up healthy boundaries. Now, I want to just break this down really simple for you. Okay, Jesus gives us a couple rules. Number 1, personally address the individual. Again, not social media. I'm going to go to you one-on-one and say, hey, this is what's going on. All right? It really bothers me that you do this. Hey, I keep getting hurt by this. Is that what's really going on? Number 2, work with a couple individuals, maybe a mediator to help solve the problem, maybe someone who's going to pour in and give wisdom. It doesn't mean go get 2 people to be on your team and beat up the other person. It means go get someone to help you solve the problem. And number 3, assess the boundaries. Again, there's people that are so hurt that you're not going to be able to move forward, and you got to go, all right, where is my healthy boundary that protects me and ultimately protects you until you're willing to be transformed by grace. And until then, I'm just going to keep loving you. It's not that I don't care. It's just I got to love you from here. Because every time I get my life entangled with yours, I end up a train wreck too. Healthy boundaries. Which leads us to, here's a piece that has changed kind of my life in the last half year. Okay? James 4. James 4 is a great scripture. The book of James, Brother James says, hey, what causes fights and quarrels? Actually, in my Bible, I wrote a little line down because it was at the end of like the little line. So I wrote another little fill-in-the-blank line so that I could imaginarily write in what it is. What causes fights and quarrels? When da-da-da-da-da. when da-da-da-da-da. That's what causes fights and quarrels. James says, don't they come from your desire to battle within you? Listen, he says, you desire but do not have, so you kill. Hold on, you go, not about me. I don't kill. When I don't get what I want, that's not what I do. I don't think, hey, I didn't get what I want. I want to go murder my neighbor, right? Hold on. Remember what Jesus said? Jesus said, hey, if you've ever hated your brother or sister, you've already committed murder. So he's brought it all the way from Jesus and said, hey, this is very serious. What causes quarrels? Well, when you quarrel, often you don't handle it well, and you end up hating. Now you're a murderer. He says you covet, but you cannot get what you want. You quarrel and you fight. Again, let me make it simple for you. All right? He says this. He says, look, we quarrel because you don't get what you want. You get in a fight because you don't get what you want. Hold on. I want to remind you, it doesn't mean what you want is always bad. Sometimes what you want is good, right? But sometimes what you want is not so good. And so we got to identify the reason I'm excited, the reason I'm emotional is because I'm not getting what I want. Or here's a way to say it that is, again, it's just kind of changed my mentality the last half year. I've been saving it to preach for this message for a half year, and I just want you to know it's done wonders for my marriage. It's done wonders for my kids. And here's what James is saying. He's saying that you experience conflict because you're not getting what you want. Here's the phrase I want to teach you. You ready? It goes like this, all right? You know what the problem is. I'm not getting what I want. Listen, if you start using this, I promise it will change your life. So watch how this works. I'm going to give you a positive example, all right? In our house, there are certain individuals that are not as old as Sarah and I who have trouble picking up after themselves. I know that's hard to imagine. And we have a bunch of them that live at our house. A bunch of them. A bunch of them. In fact, sometimes our house is full of them that aren't even living with us, and they do the same thing, right? And so I'm walking through the house, and I'm stepping on toys, and I'm stepping on clothes, and I'm stepping on who knows what. Our little vacuum cleaner thing that's supposed to go around and do its job and suck stuff up like a robot can't even do its job because there's so much stuff it can't even work, right? And I'm getting angry, and I'm walking around, and I stop, and I use my phrase that I learned from the book of James. I said, you know what the problem is? I'm not getting what I want. And what I want is good. I want my kids to be mature and pick up after themselves. That's good. I want them to be responsible with their stuff, not just say, it goes on the floor. I want them to say it has a place. And in order to be mature and healthy, it goes there. So what I want isn't always bad. And when I use that phrase and I say it, and again, you got to say it out loud. Don't say it in your head. That's being chicken, all right? I want you to say it out loud. You know what the problem is? I'm not getting what I want. I want my kids to pick up their toys. And my brain goes, good. Sounds like a good thing. I'm going to sit down and give you my bad example. I don't know if any of you know, it's the end of the school year, right? And my wife is administration on school, and what happens the last couple weeks of school is everybody loses their mind. And the inmates are running the asylum. It's just crazy, all right? And if you want to hear stories about people who just, from the kids to other people who've lost their mind, just talk to her for a while. She'll tell you about the end of the school year. And we've been together. My mother was in school, and so I know like this happens every year, and we call this our seasonal dysfunctional time in a sense of, hey, it's just going to be difficult for our marriage, right? And here's what happens. Sarah comes in the other day, and she boom right by me, right into the bedroom, and I don't even know what she's doing. I assume she's laying down. And as I'm sitting there, I look up, and I'm like, what do? I start making up a narrative, right? I don't even think she cares about me. I could probably be dead, and she wouldn't notice until the dishes started packing up, right? And I start making, I don't even know why I'm around, right? Because she clearly doesn't even think about me, right? There's all my negative narratives. And where do they come from? From wounds in my past, right? And so I get up, and I'm going to go talk to her. And what I want to say is, hey, you walk right by, you don't give me a kiss, you don't give me a hug, you don't bend down and say, oh, Master Aaron, let me rub your feet. No, none of that ever happens, right? And so I'm getting ready to walk into the bedroom, and I stop, and I say it out loud. And I say, you know what the problem is? I'm not getting what I want. I want your attention. And then my brain goes, it's the last 2 weeks of school. I bet she's had a really tough day. You sound pretty selfish when you say that out loud. Now, in fairness, if our marriage went a long time and I never got attention, that's dysfunctional marriage, right? So it might need to be addressed eventually, but I know that's not the case. I know this is a temporary moment where my wife doesn't normally run into the bedroom and not say hi, that she's exhausted. Maybe something went on. And by saying this out loud, you know what the problem is? I'm just not getting what I want. I want your attention. My brain goes, that might not be the best thing to say. So instead, I open the door and I go in and say, hey, how was your day? Looks like it was a tough day. I tell you what, that conversation went much better than the original one I wanted to have. But just by filtering my emotions and saying this out loud, I'm able to hear, man, do I sound like a selfish guy? Or is this something that needs to be addressed? And again, you can handle this with any situation. You got a roommate problem, you got a coworker problem, just say it out loud. In fact, I often will just say it to the person. You know what the problem is? I'm not getting what I want. What I want is for you to, go back to the beginning, bring me home lunch. You know what the problem is? I'm not getting what I want. What I want is for you to pick up the towels. You know what the problem is? I'm not getting what I want. What I want is for you to begin to meet all my needs, even when I don't tell them. Oh, boy, that doesn't sound good at all, does it? Again, how do we handle conflict? Well, I start running my conflict through this filter from the book of James, and then I can begin to distinguish, is this something we should cover? And then I go back to the laws of Jesus, and I say, well, the first thing I should do once I recognize it's something I should cover is go put it on social media. No. What's it say? What's the rule Jesus taught us? Go to someone one-on-one. Have that conversation with their face. Now again, why is this important? Well, this is important. Why? Well, because if we're going to be a church, all right, that unchurched people want to come to, they got to be able to go, man, that church handles conflict. In fact, we should be the place that other people go to study how to do it. They should come and say, hey, how do you make sure all your marriages are doing well? Hey, how come when people come to your church, there's a higher marriage sustainability rate? Hey, how come when families come to your church that their families seem to handle well? How come when there's conflict in your church, it seems to like you guys kind of, like you cover it so well, like we want to come and study how to do that. And when the church begins to handle conflict in a biblical way, the world will recognize us by our love for Jesus and our love for each other. Because ultimately it's a sign of spiritual maturity and spiritual health. How we handle conflict. And Paul models this for us in an excellent way by saying, I went to Cephas, Peter, and I said to him face to face, this is what's going on. So pause. Can you think of a moment in the past week when if you had said, you know what the problem is? I'm not getting what I want, ... that the situation would have been different? I bet you can. Now, if you're like me, go back one slide. If you're like me, you may go, Jocelyn, go back one slide. You may go, hey, I can't remember this. Take a photo, all right? It's also in your bulletin. And put it on your fridge. Now, I'm going to help you right here. You ready? I'm going to help you right here. Heath, the next time you're in a fight with Amy, don't stop and go, you know, Aaron said you're supposed to say this. That's not a good idea. Okay, I would wait till you've made up and that you took her out for dinner and said, I'm sorry, baby, I love you, I'm a ding-a-ling, right? And then say to her this way, I just want you to know I'm really working hard on what Aaron said out of the book of James. And I just love the phrase, you know what the problem is? I'm not getting what I want, and I'm trying to use it more, baby. All right, and that might go over much better. And the reason I'm helping you out here is because I really didn't want you to call and be like, hey, I got to sleep on your couch because she's now blaming both of us. All right? So, again, don't bring that up in the midst of the conflict. But somewhere when it's all cool, again, just keep it on your fridge and on occasion. If you say it, you're modeling it for your family and for your spouse. You know what the problem is? I'm not getting what I want. ...